old. First of all, I would like to thank Dave Coons for inviting me to this special commemoration, Colonel Collins and Commander Alvarez for your leadership and service, and Roy Knight for sharing your father's amazing story. I would also like to acknowledge and thank all the veterans, and especially the Vietnam veterans, for their dedication and service to our great nation. My story is that of an 8-year-old child growing up between 1973 and 1975 in Saigon, Vietnam, and her journey to America. I recall walking to school petrified, listening to the bone-chilling sounds of bombs falling in the distance. I remember sharing with my mother that I didn't want to go to school, that I was scared. She explained in her own comforting words that these sounds, although dangerous, were far away and temporary. I believed my mother's words and continued to make my daily walks to school. South Vietnamese soldiers began to enter our home and those of our neighbors for routine checks. Their orders were to ensure that none of us were sheltering any Viet Cong. Although our lives were interrupted by these routine checks, strangely enough, and through the eyes of a child, they were exciting at first. I regularly eavesdropped on my parents as they discussed about the war, but I never understood what it really meant. One day, I watched my parents scramble to sew carry-ons, and then when I asked what they were for, my mother's response was that we needed them for personal items and food as we were planning to leave Saigon. Somehow, I thought we were leaving to see my father's parents in Hue, which is a city in central Vietnam. But my mother replied that we were leaving Vietnam as the Viet Cong were invading Saigon. And living under the wrath of communism was not an option. Fear also drove the decision to leave, as my father, a former high-ranking officer in the South Vietnamese army, would certainly be subjected to torture and possible death. Days before the fall of Saigon, we were awakened in the middle of the night by my parents as those bone-chilling sounds returned, but this time they were much louder. We were instructed to crawl on the floor towards my Uncle Tan, who was waiting outside to help us board a small transport bus. I then realized this was the moment we all dreaded. I watched my mother hand our house key to our neighbor, asking her to watch over our home. We left for the airport and stopped to pick up my Aunt Jacqueline and her 3 young daughters along the way. As we made our way to Saigon International Airport, I thought we were the only family leaving the country. But upon arrival, realized that thousands of desperate faces, also gripped by fear and uncertainty, were everywhere. Everything was in chaos. The saddest moment for me came when my mother and uncle parted. I remember my mother begging my uncle to come with us, but he couldn't as his family wasn't with him. They embraced and sobbed for what seemed like the longest time. It was a profound and emotional moment for me to witness. I knew my uncle's weekly visits would never happen again. We were led into the airport terminal where we staged and waited and ate what little food my parents were able to pack in our carry-ons and continued to wait anxiously. My father had made a cardboard sign with the number 16. 13 children in all, my aunt's father and 5.5-month pregnant mother. A few days passed and terror erupted again as the front of the airport was bombed. Thousands of people huddled towards the back area of the terminal. Children cried in desperation, looking for their mothers or fathers. People scrambled with whatever they had in hand, screaming and crying. It was a state of utter chaos. Throughout, our family of 16 held hands and huddled tightly so as not to be separated. We were informed the airport would soon shut down due to the consistent barrage of bombings and that only people with proper documentation would be allowed to leave. This meant the U.S. military support staff and South Vietnamese personnel and their families. Even though we would qualify, my parents thought there was a slim chance that this many people would be evacuated and that we should return home while still possible. During the confusion, my aunt approached a U.S. soldier with her 3 young daughters in tow and pleaded that if she and her young daughters stayed or were left behind, they would all be tortured or killed because of her employment with the U.S. Embassy. The soldier empathized and agreed to let my aunt and her daughters through the checkpoint. She added that she also had her sister's family with her, and since her brother-in-law was a former officer in the South Vietnamese Army, that he would also certainly meet torture or death. An additional complication was that my father had no official paperwork for our family at the time. The soldier asked how many families members there would be in total, and my aunt replied 16. His initial response was that our family size was now too big and it would be impossible for him to get everyone through. But her continued pleading paid off. The soldier finally agreed but gave very specific instructions. He told my aunt to return with both families at 7 a.m. the next morning. He informed her that there will be 2 lines, one for the people with paperwork and the other for families without. He instructed her to go straight to the paperwork line and for our family to follow and to keep moving, and that he would be there to give us a hand signal to pass. My aunt went back to my parents and begged them not to go back home and to take this chance, and there would be no opportunity again. My parents were nervous and unsure because our fate was completely dependent upon this unknown stranger. After much back and forth, my parents agreed. The next morning, we followed the instructions and approached the gate where he was stationed. We waited for his hand signal and kept walking behind my aunt, who had her papers in hand. This unknown stranger and compassionate human being, our angel, let us pass by and onto our chance for freedom. We then proceeded towards a waiting helicopter, and I vividly remember the deafening sounds from rotating propellers as soldiers frantically instructed us to board. I remember my parents telling us to hold each other's hands and not let go. We were packed in like sardines. Cries of fear and the smell of sweat was overwhelming. So many thoughts raced through my mind. I was fearful of the unknown. I was afraid we would crash or get shot down by the enemy. Every minute seemed like an eternity. As we flew out to sea, intense rain poured down and dark, stormy skies made our flight even more ominous. As we landed on the midway, the scene was chaotic. I heard my mother's voice counting aloud to make sure all 16 were present. I remember seeing so many American sailors. Some were helping the elderly, some were caring for the injured, and some carried babies, which I now believe were mostly orphans. I remember being surrounded by desperation. Once on board, we slept outside on deck as we were one of the last groups to land on the midway. We were provided blankets which we used to spread out on the deck and sheets we used to shield ourselves from sun and wind. And I felt a strange sense of freedom from the fresh ocean air. In retrospect, this was a blessing because many people below deck passed illnesses from one to another due to cramped living quarters. Many families had to confront death at sea, as did my infant sister, Chrissy, who was gravely ill due to malnutrition. My father contemplated the unthinkable, the real possibility of having to commit her to sea. But my mother's maternal instinct and refusal to give up saved her life. Daily meals were served in small white foam cups filled halfway with soggy rice and sardines. Although I never liked sardines, I was extremely grateful to have something to eat. Watered down powdered carnation milk was rationed to stretch supply for the thousands of refugees on board. A vivid memory was temporary restrooms on the upper deck constructed of wood planks that stretched out over the open ocean, with bedsheets strung up for privacy. These makeshift accommodations needed in order to provide for our care were quickly handmade, and I also remember these sailors doing their routine walks throughout the day, checking in on our welfare, which made me finally feel protected and safe. I somehow realized that every single displaced person on board, young and old, was embarking on the same unknown journey. Some of us soon-to-be Americans, which included our family, were once well off. Now, all of us were homeless, left with only limited possessions we were able to hand carry with us. Even under these crazy circumstances, I felt a strange sense of peace as I was grateful to be with my family as we embraced our newfound fate together. And I recall often rubbing my mother's stomach with anticipation of my new baby brother or sister. One of my cherished memories came after meals. I couldn't wait along with my siblings to gather with the sailors who told us stories about America, jokes, and on occasion entertained us with magic tricks. The crew was always kind and helpful. A highlight was when we had our first taste of M&Ms, which is still my favorite treat until today. We sailed at sea for a week and arrived at Subic Bay in the Philippines, so we stayed for almost a month. We then moved to Wake Island for 2 more months, and then boarded a transport plane to our final destination, Camp Pendleton, the USA, in July of 1975, where my youngest sister was also born on July 22nd. She was given the name Hatful, which means happiness. Sadly, my mother succumbed to stomach cancer in 1978. Just 3 short years after our arrival, I always felt the stress of war and what she gave of herself to bring our family through to America and freedom took its toll on her body. She will always be my hero. My journey to America is, of course, something I will never forget. My family and I are forever grateful and will cherish our time spent on the Midway and at Camp Pendleton. We were always treated with kindness and respect, and not as refugees, by brave men and women who were summoned to fight a foreign war and rescue helpless strangers. Their dedication, bravery, and sacrifice made it possible for my family and me, along with so many like me, to be able to realize the American dream. I pray our children will never have to experience war. I still get emotional whenever I watch archival footage from the war. We've come so far. Our history must pass on to younger generations. Future generations must understand and appreciate the price so many paid for the freedom they now enjoy. I still get chills every time I recite the words to our national anthem, and came across a slightly modified quote from the anthem that left a huge impact on me. Land of the free, because of the brave. And I would like to add to that quote, Midway brave. Freedom is something that should never be taken for granted. There is so much good in the world. I personally witnessed the best of humanity from so many in the armed forces, including Admiral Larry Chambers, and veterans like you in attendance, who came to Vietnam to save thousands, including an 8-year-old child like me. I am therefore forever a proud American, and would like to express my deepest gratitude to all veterans on this special day. Thank you.